Art and Science of Politics series. This is Remind's second event. I'd first just like to take a minute to thank Dr. Nersessian and Francis. They've been really incredibly supportive, the formation of Remind, and also guiding for our future events, which I'll tell you about in a second. Also, thank you to Adam Ludwig for his logistical work. As many of you know, this is our second event, the first on the Art and Science of Politics series. For those of you who are new tonight, welcome. Remind was formed from a group of recent college graduates and graduate students, and we are focused on hosting roundtables for established and emerging minds across disciplines. If you'd like to be involved in any way in that process, please come talk to any of us after the roundtable. Remind's made up of myself, David Heck, David, right over here, Lee Kiang, here. Oh, right there. And Cassie Kaufman and Jonathan Lebov, who will be sitting on the panel tonight. This event is largely their conception, so thank you for all your hard work. There's a lot to look forward to with this series. Next we have the Voters and Friends, which is going to be on October 15th at 7 p.m. here. It's going to focus on group psychology and political belief. After that, we have the Design of Influence, How Images and Words Sway Minds. That's going to be on October 22nd, also at 7 p.m. Also look out for the rest of the sex roundtables. You can see the art around you is also congruent with this series. And that's continuing through October along with the poetry and music series as well. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator right in front of me here, John Neffinger. John is a partner at KNP Communications, which specializes in preparing speakers and speeches for public audiences. He previously served as communications director for both the Truman National Security Project and Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And he's worked as a management consultant and attorney. He's a contributor at the Huffington Post and has appeared in national print and broadcast media discussing voter psychology, charisma, and nonverbal communication. Most recently, he's worked for the last year training Democratic congressional candidates. So thank you, John. I'm going to turn this over to you. I also wanted just to mention quickly that you can also join our online discussion on the Remind website, which we'll tell you about at the end of the event. Thank you.
Very good, Kara. Thank you very much. And we have a wonderful crowd tonight. Thank you all for coming out for this. What I want to do just to get this kicked off is to briefly tell you who the panelists are in case you're reading the bios on the sheet that you found there on your chair. And then we're going to kick it off with some comments from each of our panelists before we get into the conversation. So first, to my left, we have David Amodio, and then Joy Hirsch is right here. And right to my right is Alex Todorov. I'm going to do a dramatic reading of his bio for our purposes, and then he's going to take it away for a couple of minutes, and then we'll move around and hear from the rest of our panelists. So Alex received his PhD in psychology from NYU in 2002. This is your turn to be embarrassed. NYU in 2002. Since then, he's been an assistant professor of psychology and public affairs at Princeton. His primary research focus is on the cognitive and neural mechanisms underlying social cognition. His research on the neural basis of face evaluation has been funded by the National Science Foundation. Alex, take it away.
All right. Well, this particular project wasn't funded by the National Science Foundation, for the record. I wasn't ever really interested in political psychology. It's just I'm interested in social cognition and how people form first impressions. And somehow this line of work led me to study political elections. And what we know from work in my lab and many other labs is that these judgments, for example, deciding whether somebody is trustworthy or not, whether somebody is competent, are made fairly rapidly. I mean, you'll see some demonstrations, but you need a single glance, which is, you need about 100 milliseconds exposure to a face to make these judgments. One caveat is that I'm not saying that these judgments are accurate. This is an entirely different point, but yet people agree when they make those judgments. So they're fairly rapid, they're fairly spontaneous. That is, you don't need to intend to judge people. You walk into a party and you immediately, you've already classified the people. If you do functional neuroimaging studies, you find out that many of these judgments are really the the neural regions that observe these judgments are the same regions that observe a lot of the emotional processes. I'm sure we'll talk later about structures like the amygdala, which is critical for fear conditioning, consolidation of emotional memories, general vigilance, and a number of other functions. And all of these regions are involved whenever you engage in this social evaluation. So what did we do? This was one of my early projects in Princeton, but the question was, would that matter for voting decisions, the fact that we engage in these rapid judgments and then we make them so effortlessly? And you can come up with many reasons why they shouldn't count. First of all, from a rational perspective, you get a lot of candidate information, so this first fleeting impression should be easily overwritten. From an ideological perspective, and we will hear from David about the role of ideology, we know it's incredibly important, party affiliation should sway all of these such initial impressions. And finally, from even voters' perspective, you don't hear people saying, I voted for this person because they just look great. I mean, usually it's appeal to their policy positions, their record, etc., etc. Yet, if you look in what psychology has done in the last 30 or 40 years, I think that there's a general consensus that much of our mental life is guided by rapid, snap judgments, snap decisions that often never register in our consciousness radars. We like to believe that we're in control of our lives and it's all about volition and will, but much often than we want to believe, completely small things can make big difference. And a lot, in fact, in modern social psychology, and not even modern social psychology, the classical social psychology is about the power of the situation, how little things can make huge difference. So to get to the specific research, what we did, it's not a very complicated research. We present participants, which are actually most of the time undergraduate students, with pictures of the winner and the runner-up of political elections. We've done this for Senate elections, gubernatorial elections. And we've done this also prospectively, so in that case we pick up the candidates from the two major parties. We also make sure that if a participant recognizes any of the faces, their judgments are not used. So we want to make sure that whatever we are getting, it's based solely on first impressions. And just for the record, someone might say, well, they might not recognize it, but probably somehow they have basic familiarity from the media. Two political scientists in MIT replicated these findings for Mexican elections with judgment of MIT students. So I'll leave it at that, this kind of concerns. And what you're seeing here is a scatter plot where each point is a Senate race from 2000, 2002, 2004. And on the horizontal axis is essentially the difference in competence of the candidates. And in the vertical axis is the difference in votes. So what you see is there is a relationship between how much competent a person looks and the margin of victory. If this is, you can see this more clearly updated with the latest elections from 2006. And there's a fairly strong, well, in terms of social science, you see it's noisy, of course, you're far from perfect prediction, but in terms of social science finding, there's a sizable relationship. If you think about how many, what is the percentage of races that we can pick up, it's about 70%, 70, 72, depending on a number of different factors. So that's not that much. It's better than chance, but you have to remember it's a single slice of information. That's just a single slice of first impression. And so I want you to focus now, and you will see a flash of two pictures, which is rather long from experimental point of view. And if you're an experimental subject, you will see a fixation point maybe for 500 milliseconds. And then I can repeat it again. So this is about, depending on the constraints of the projector, probably 200 milliseconds. But in fact, that's plenty of time.
That? Yeah? Okay.
And then you put, of course, a mask, because if you don't mask the images, they actually persist in your brain longer. And we did this with predicting gubernatorial elections. Even after 100 millisecond exposure, we can predict about 62% of the election. If you increase the exposure time to 250 milliseconds, things get a little bit better. and they don't get better after that. If you give people unlimited time, they don't get better. If you force them to make a judgment within 2 seconds, if you leave them on their own devices, it takes about 3 seconds and a half. It's until we press the response on the computer. So 2 seconds is a fairly short time. It forces you to rely on these rapid automatic processes. And even on the response deadline, they do pretty well. The conditions that they do worse is when you ask them to think about the faces and make a good decision. Then they're still above chance, but it's 60% accuracy. And in fact, all of this deliberation makes them worse. So I don't want this to be misinterpreted. It doesn't mean that if people are given actually diagnostic information, the policy record of the candidate, their performance, this deliberation will help. When you make this kind of snap judgments, we basically have no idea how we are making it. I mean, it's a single glance. You have some sense that you saw the face. You make a judgment that agree with many other people. You really have no idea how you made it. If I ask you, you will give me a theory, but chances I probably will be wrong. So that's the point. The point of this study is that a lot of these first impressions are driven by fairly automatic unconscious processes. So finish with that.
Excellent. I just want to make a point on this research in particular. I was actually up at the Kennedy School at the time that Alex was doing this research, working with a couple of Harvard economists on some similar research that was not nearly as precise and well done as what Alex has shown you here. But they did do one other thing. They were able to do some of this roughly. Actually, how many of you in here have read the book Blink? You know the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell, right? The thin slicing research he talks about in there, right? That's where the Harvard economists I was working with came to this. And so we were able to get some of this effect. We weren't able to jack it up anywhere near 67% like Alex was able to do here. But they took one step further and actually looked at these particular races and compared the prediction of the outcome based on this, what you see here, the thin slicing, with the prediction of the outcome from those particular races based on the campaign spending of each one. Now, anybody here who's been involved in political practice at all knows how big a deal campaign spending is in terms of the way you run a campaign. And what they found was basically this was more predictive, or at least very comparable, of the election outcome at the end of the day to campaign spending. Now, Kara mentioned I do some work with candidates. When I tell them that, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. So, Alex, I want to thank you personally for bringing this to our attention, because that, if the question before us on the table today is, can this kind of work actually speak directly to political practice, this is the very first data point that I would cite to say, yes, there is some real applicability. And we can talk about that some more later. But first, I want to turn it over now to Joy, and I'll do your traumatic reading. Joy is a professor of neuroscience, psychology, and functional neuroradiology at Columbia University. She's also director of the program for imaging and cognitive sciences, which includes an imaging center devoted to the multidisciplinary investigation of mind, brain, and behavior. Using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, familiar to folks, Professor Hirsch and her students and colleagues have investigated the neural mechanisms that regulate emotion, cognition, perception, and decision-making. These, along with ongoing investigations there, have led to the discovery of a class of neural circuits that modulate and regulate emotional and strategic decisions. Joy, you want to tell us some more about that?
Well, thank you, John.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that was quite an impressive interpretive
I got
reading.
through it.
This was very good. This was very good. Well, I feel very humbled about being here, because I am not an expert in political thought or looking at the mind-brain interface when it's engaged in political decisions. But I think what I can contribute here is some backup support to some ideas about how neuroimaging actually can interface with some of these ideas. And what I'd like to point out are some of the advantages and some of the disadvantages, because I think that studies like what Alex Alex has just presented are very difficult to capture with a neuroimaging technique, and yet the technique is so important for us because we can actually watch the brain in real life working that I think it's important for us to think about how we might do that. So to that end, what I'd like to do is just spend a couple introductory moments talking just a little bit about the basics of functional imaging and some of the advantages and disadvantages, and then use that as a background as we think further about how we could use imaging as we continue to investigate these types of questions. First, there's just two really simple ideas. And the first is the unity principle, and that is what Francis Crick calls the astonishing hypothesis, that when we study the brain, we study the mind, and if you want to understand the mind, go to the brain. That there's one set of neurons, and one set of neurons governs both. And that's astonishing to many people who like to think that the mind is something special and something other than the brain. If you're a neuroscientist, you think of the brain in terms of its neurons, and we can understand mechanism of mind by looking at mechanism of brain. The second hypothesis, and it's the only other one that we really need to think about these questions, is what we call the real estate principle. And that is the fundamental organization of the brain is that specific parts of the brain or specific systems in the brain do specific things. And so we can begin to ask questions like, are there parts of the brain that are specifically associated with specific types of attitudes, values, questions, decision types? And that brings us a little closer to this idea. But I think that we have to step back just for a moment and think about some of the limitations of the methodology. And the big limitation of functional imaging is that although we can watch the brain at work, we have to watch the brain at work under very, very constrained circumstances. We can't ask our voters, for example, to wear magnetic resonance imaging machines. It just doesn't work. So we have to take our individual subjects, constrain them, put them in. If you've ever had an MRI, and if you know what I'm talking about, this is not exactly a warm and friendly, cuddly environment. It makes a lot of noise, you're constrained, you feel claustrophobic, and the experimenter is outside giving you a whole lot of relatively arbitrary things you have to do in a time frame, and you're pushing buttons and you're looking at things and you're making decisions. People are taking pictures of your brain, and that is how we think about our models, getting evidence for how the brain actually works. So it's very, very constrained, and yet it's the best we have. And for the advantage is that a good behavioral neuroscientist, that means somebody that has designed a good experiment with proper controls based on a good set of behavior, can actually make inferences about the machinery in the brain that actually drives the processes. And what we have basically learned, now this is a real overview, but this is my whole point, is to provide a grand overview here. We'll refine this with the details, is that we can think of the mind as being more or less neurologically driven by two sort of separate systems. There's the emotional system and the executive cognitive system. Now that's too simplistic to be really true, but this allows us a moment to think about this. And that's the entry point at which we sort of begin to think about political thought, because it's the notion that each of these brains relate to each other, and they relate to each other in different ways depending on individual differences. And I think that maybe this is the point where my introduction is going to end, and I'll turn it over to the next person, but we can sort of use that as a backdrop to add some details on as we think about sort of the behavioral studies that take us the next step. Does that
Absolutely.
make sense?
Yeah. One other, while we're going through this kind of exploring the beginnings of the case of how to relate each of these specialties to political practice, though, I just wanted to bring up one thing that you and I were talking about a little bit before we got going here. How many of you in the audience are familiar with the idea of mirror neurons? A lot of people familiar? Are some unfamiliar with mirror neurons? Yes. Okay. So I see some heads nodding. The idea, and you must correct me because I will get this wrong, even though I say it to a lot of people all the time. But I'm the rough and ready guy here. Mirror neurons, if I'm getting this right, the way we have this big occipital lobe, right, at the back of our heads here, right, that processes visual information, and some of those neural networks do the interpretation of body language, right? What it is that we're seeing when we look at another human being, like Alex was talking about here. And when we see someone smiling, right? This is a kind of a new agey moment in our program tonight. When we see someone smiling, the way that we interpret that visual stimulus is actually to reproduce a little bit within ourselves what we think we would be feeling if we looked that way. Is that right? Did I get that mostly right? I hope so, because I've told a lot of people that.
Sounds good to me.
You're shaking your head. I don't know.
No,
Yeah?
it sounds good to me.
It's not
Well,
right. What?
it sounds
But
good
I
to
like
me.
the fable so much. This really way off. Well, you know what? This goes to another point that we're making here this evening, which is the rational stuff really doesn't matter. It's really what when little quick political anecdote here. Do you remember Ronald Reagan? Everyone remembers him vaguely, kind of, sorta. And he would say things like that trees cause pollution and whatnot. And every once in a while, David Gergen tells his story. One of his advisors would come to him and would say, sir, that thing that you just mentioned, that's not exactly true, the thing about trees and pollution. And he would say, they know what I mean. So with that, I take back everything that I said about mirror neurons and turn it back over to you, Joy.
What I said is that it could be right, but let me just tell you the mirror neuron story. There were neurons in the parietal lobe, actually, that were discovered with people doing single unit recordings in monkeys. And what they discovered is that these neurons would actually fire, not if the monkey was doing the action, but if the monkey was seeing the action. And that hence the name mirror neurons. And so they were responsive to behaviors that were being processed but not actually done. And apparently I still didn't get it right.
No, that's right so far. That's the data.
That is the data. I'm sorry. There may be much more.
We may have to take this outside later. Okay.
And so there's been a lot of work that's been done since, probably some of which I don't understand. But the basic concept is that imitations provide activities in areas that are specialized for that activity. For example, the visual system. One can watch somebody doing something, and the visual activity is actually observed in those areas. And it's thought that these mirror neurons are very important for learning behaviors, maybe even conveying emotion. That's the part that I think that is...
That I was going for to connect it to politics?
It's a nice idea, and
There you go.
I don't know any data that supports that, but it could.
The piece that connects back to politics is, I will tell you that in my job coaching candidates to make good or leave good impressions along the lines that Alex was describing earlier, about 80% of what I do is telling adults to stand up straight and to smile. And specifically the smiling and the connection that makes. I think the mirror neurons under some interpretations have something to do with why that is well received by us.
John,
with that, let me leave it there and actually, do you want to?
Before you introduce me, actually, I wouldn't mind chiming in because mirror neurons, it's true. These are, monkey sees the monkey grabs a raisin. Monkeys love raisins. They're going to put it in front of the monkey's going to want to grab it. If it grabs it, the parietal neuron starts firing. If the monkey's sitting there and the experimenter or maybe another monkey hand grabs that raisin, the same neuron fires. And so the ambiguity there is that neuron the representation of some other monkey grabbing that raisin? Like, it's the same as if the monkey was doing it? Or is it more like, I want that raisin. I'm thinking of grabbing it right now, but I've got my arm taped behind my back. So I think actually it's really debatable and it's controversial and it's not too far, at least I know different people have different views, but I'm glad you brought it up so we can dispel these things. But it's almost in the realm of dinosaurs walked the earth 4,000 years ago. Not maybe quite in the same spectrum, but I think it's one of those things that people think is a truth, but it's not. And it would be fun if other things like that come up.
It's still very
tonight.
contested. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, with that, since you've already opened the discussion, let me go back and introduce you. David Amodio is an assistant professor of psychology at NYU and the director of the NYU Social Neuroscience Lab. His research examines the roles of emotion and motivation in the regulation of social behavior with a special emphasis on intergroup, not intergroup relations. His research has illuminated the neural and psychological mechanisms that lead to prejudiced emotions, beliefs, minds and behaviors. In his recent work, Dr. Murillo investigated the neural underpinnings of political ideology in an effort to understand the links between the brain, the mind, and political behavior. And so it won't be very hard to get a data point out of this. We're technology dependent here. Hold on a second. So with that,
all we need to do is help me start it.
Escape.
Escape. Yeah.
And we've escaped. And then we'll find you down here.
Okay.
Actually, I can try and do this if you want.
Sure, no problem. Thanks so much for inviting me. This is a real pleasure, and it's an extremely timely topic. And it's kind of cool that neuroscience and psychology is getting to the point where we can start to weigh in on real life issues, you know. Science meets real life. That's always great. Like politics, and the campaign is especially going on right now is especially important. So, like Alex, I'm a social psychologist, and I really care about how people interact with one another, how emotions come up in the mind, how we perceive others quickly, and how all those things determine the way that we interact with others. Like Alex and like Joy also, my view of all of this is that if I want to understand how the mind works, we know a lot about what's going on with the brain. So it's kind of like a car mechanic. You know, you could pop open the hood and see how the gears all fit together. That's a little bit better than maybe just putting your ear against the hood and trying to, you know, say, well, that's a clanking noise. That must be the carburetor. That's shows what I know about cars. But so anyway, I also kind of stumbled into thinking about politics and how it relates to the mind, in part from one of my colleagues, John Jost at NYU. And so I guess I'll just start. I brought some slides to tell you about the research we did. There's a lot of interest right now in how the brain relates to politics. And the way Joy referred to this a little bit, the way that it's been studied a lot is let's put somebody in a magnet, that's the fMRI scanner, and show them pictures of different candidates and see what lights up in the brain, see what gets activated in the brain, and just try to interpret that. And there are a lot of kind of ambiguities with that. Maybe if you don't mind, I'll just quick say the logic behind that is people do a bunch of studies where they measure people's brain activity as they look at known things like ice cream sundaes versus spiders and snakes. And you might say, oh, well, when they look at snakes, all these parts of the brain light up, right? So then people infer, well, those are all the negative emotion parts of the brain. And I'm simplifying, I'm kind of giving, and she's the expert. So then the idea is, well, let's put people in the scanner and show them pictures of Hillary Clinton and Rudy Giuliani. Well, do the same parts of the brain light up? And if they do, then people infer, well, I guess they must have been feeling, you know, afraid. They probably could have asked people with those studies how they were just feeling, right? Yeah, Rudy Giuliani in drag, that ought to scare you. But so there's a lot of ambiguities because you don't know exactly when somebody looks at a snake and part of the brain lights up, you don't know what that part of the brain is really doing. There's a lot of things when you're strapped in a scanner looking at a snake that's going on in your head, and not all of it's necessarily fear. So there's ambiguity. Anyway, we didn't take that approach, and so I'll tell you kind of a different approach that we took. So my interest got back to, again, working with my colleague who studies ideology, and broadly that has to do with thinking about liberalism to conservatism, this broad spectrum. It defines broadly a lot of political thought throughout history and throughout cultures. The names sometimes change, but it's there. And what my colleague, John Jost, studies is all these, let's see if this thing works.
Oh, this probably does.
Yeah, let me.
Or maybe not.
Yeah, there we go. I know it works. So what John did is, there's a little delay. I'm good. Scanned a lot of different studies to see how ideology, your degree of liberalism to conservatism, relates to more basic psychological processes and psychological variables. The idea is, well, I guess this question is ideology its own unique thing, or does it arise from more basic needs and attitudes and this, yeah. And so, for example, he looked at the relation between ideology and variables such as, this is just a little smattering here, but intolerance of ambiguity. This is when people are confronted with ambiguous information, do they really not like it, or are they okay with it? You know, if you have the pros and cons in front of you, can you handle that or not? Other issues, integrative complexity. Can you integrate in your mind a lot of complex information? These are kind of self-explanatory. And a whole range of things. And what he showed, and what he found is that indeed ideology was predictive significantly of all these more basic psychological variables. And so what John's message has been is that there are real psychological differences between liberals and conservatives, and they're along these lines. I will point out that his research ends up making liberals sound better. But yeah, well, judging by the paintings on the wall, I'm guessing this crowd's okay with that. But but that's not to say that we're truly fair and balanced. I like to think in science we try to be. It's not to say that there aren't positive aspects of taking a more conservative approach. Also, I'll just point out, you as an individual can be more liberal sometimes or more conservative. It depends on the situation. So sometimes it's adaptive to take a more conservative approach with things, like your finances maybe. Maybe. All right. This is just a slide that John gave me. This is just one example of some of the findings, and he's got a lot of these. And I'll just orient you. So on this side, these bars represent when conservatives, the more conservative you are, the more you show intolerance of ambiguity. The more conservative on the bottom here you are, the more you feel this need that things need to be structured and ordered, and they need to come. You don't like loose ends. Whereas liberals, these are the two middle ones here. Liberalism's correlate with openness to new experiences. Also, the dealing with uncertainties in your world or more complexities. Again, this sounds kind of tinged in a way, but that's just what the results are. So I come into this at this point where John is studying how ideology, a really broad thing, relates to more basic psychological constructs. Meanwhile, I've been studying how people regulate more basic forms of behavior. And as I'll explain, it struck me that a lot of the differences John was seeing, John Jost, between liberals and conservatives related to really basic ways in which the brain processed fundamental information, not political information, just how you pick up on anything in your world, just the most fundamental level. And I'll be happy to hear what you guys think. So we asked in this research, is ideology related to fundamental ways in which our minds and our brains, obviously we think of them as the yin and yang or something, deal with information? And just briefly, here's where I was coming from. And from a neuroscience point of view, there have been some interesting models of neuroscience that start breaking down the real estate of the brain, in Joyce's words, into different functions. And this yellow area is part of the brain called this whole, see this part, I'm backing up, this is funny. This is the corpus callosum, this white, big area of white fibers that connect the two hemispheres of the brain. Right around it is a part of the brain called the cingulate cortex, and this frontal part, the anterior cingulate cortex, has been associated in lots of studies with what people call like a conflict monitoring function. So it seems to get activated when there's some inconsistency between what you're expecting to do and maybe some new information comes up and says, well, maybe you got to change your plans. Is that about right, you think? And it seems to go work in the background. It seems to pervade everything that you do. This is a part of the brain that lights up during any kind of task because it's always there helping you process information. And people think that this function, right, associated with this part of the brain, is central to self-regulation, to changing your plans when you see some information that says maybe you got to try something else. This is just a little summary of lots of studies that have shown that. I'm not going to get into this part of the brain, but the idea in terms of carving up real estate is the anterior cingulate is important for detecting when you need to do something different. And when that's detected, it signals other parts of the brain, such as other parts of the frontal cortex, the frontal lobe, that are really important for representing more complex goals and plans and letting you act on them. So this is the story, kind of the cognitive neuroscience story of self-regulation. And to me, this idea of being sensitive to situations or stimuli that say you need to change plans, you need to break out of habitual behavioral pattern, seemed really similar to what John Jost was talking about in terms of ideology with your ability to deal with complex information, pros and cons, and maybe change course when all the information tells you you need to change course. So here's what we did to test that. We got a set of participants, 43 participants in this study from UCLA. That's where I was before NYU. And we continued it at NYU. And we did a couple things. First, we measured their political attitudes. And I'll show you the measure we used in a second. And we just wanted to know, where do they place themselves on a continuum from more liberal to more conservative. Then they did a task that
Did you find conservative students at those two institutions?
Yeah, we did. We had to beat the bushes a little bit.
Okay.
No, they were there. We didn't even have to look for them too hard. I mean, we got a spectrum.
Money and they showed up. Yeah.
No comment. I'm a scientist, so I'm not going to make those kinds of jokes, John.
I'm allowed.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Anyway, so then we had them do an experimental task that's really a classic cognitive psychology task called the go-no-go task. Go versus no-go, right, task. And I'll explain that in a second too, and you'll see why it's a really basic way of seeing how sensitive people are to changes in information that says they have to do something different. And we measured their brain activity while they did that to see if that part of the brain I showed you, that anterior cingulate cortex, really was more sensitive or responsive in more liberal participants as they were confronted with these changes in the information. Okay, using EEG. So here is I just wanted to show you what it looked like. This is a measure that we sometimes use. I think the wording is funny. It says, we hear a lot of talk these days about liberals and conservatives. These are college students, remember, so they're not necessarily way into politics. Where on the following scale of political orientation would you place yourself? And they just have to circle extremely liberal all the way up to extremely conservative. We let them do that. Also, they sit there when they come in, they fill out a packet of questionnaires, and this is hidden within that, so they don't know that this study has anything to do with politics. That's the way that we usually do it. Then they get set up for collecting brain activity, and this is a little description of what we call the go-no-go task. It's done on a computer. So imagine yourself sitting at a computer in front of the computer screen, and on the screen there are two different stimuli we use, just M's and W's. Come up on the screen quickly, one at a time. We used M's and W's, you'll see, because they're almost the inverse of each other. So it's a nice experimental control. And what they had to do is, there are 500 of these in sequence. And one of the stimuli, let's say the M, we flip this, but let's say the M. If the M comes up, the participant has to press the space bar. That's it. And they have to do it quickly. The M comes up for 100 milliseconds, fast like Alex was talking about. They have to respond within 500 milliseconds. And across 500 trials, 400 of those trials, that M comes up, and they just sit there pressing a space bar. So imagine doing that. It gets you into this habitual response pattern. You're like, oh, something happens, I press the button. It's like a lab rat, except these are humans. And anyway, so on 20% of the trials, a different thing comes up. And here, so if the M was coming up most of the time, occasionally a W would show up. And when the W came up, they're supposed to do nothing. So just stop. Okay? So it's go a lot of the times, and occasionally no go. Stop.
And just to clarify, the W doesn't represent any kind of conservative ideology, right?
This is like which bathroom to go in.
Yeah, I know, isn't it?
That's what I.
Man, if I only knew the ideas people would come up with, I didn't think about any of these. I would not have used the M's and W's.
What about Mac and Windows?
I haven't heard that one either. All right, guys, don't use M's and W's. We seriously weren't thinking about politics when we use this, obviously now. But just so you know, we did this thing called counterbalancing. So half of our subjects hit the button all the time when they saw the M's. Then we flipped it for the other half so that they hit the button all the time when they saw the W's and stopped when they saw the M's. So that way we, George W. Bush doesn't drive any of these effects. That's what people wondered. Okay, so let me just show you what happened when people did that task. This is how I'll explain what this all means. Actually, I made my graphs on a PC and we're running on a Mac, so it's cutting out a lot of some of the information. This is just a graph of how accurate people were on the task. So the bigger the bar means more accurate. And this is just to show you that they acted like they should, which is when they see if M means go, when they see the M, they're always doing it right. But when that W comes up, they make a lot of mistakes. So what it's showing is when that no-go stimulus comes up, they make mistakes about 40% of the time. They're accurate about 60% of the time. Now what we're going to do is figure out who's more likely to make mistakes than others. Are the conservatives going to make more mistakes or the liberals? Yeah, the suspense is just growing. So this is just a scatter plot, and it doesn't show anything, I'll tell you. So this is when people are just pressing the go button. Nobody differs on that. Liberals and conservatives do that almost perfectly. Now here's the important data that we showed. What I'm showing here is how accurate they are, again, on those difficult trials when they have to change their behavior really rapidly. This is on the bottom. It's just showing political orientation. So toward the left are more liberal people, toward the right are more conservatives. And what this shows is that this is actually a significant relationship. People who are more liberal, as you go up this direction, they were more accurate in correctly stopping when the information told them that they had to change. I know this sounds like a microcosm of George Bush versus John Kerry, like stay the course versus give obtuse complex answers. Or, no, just kidding. Real answers, I know, but that's how people perceived it. Okay, so what we found is that liberalism predicted more accuracy on no-go trials when you needed to change your behavior. Now, while people were doing this, we wanted to measure the brain, and so we used EEG, which is measuring electrical activity actually coming from the neurons in your brain as they're firing. And we put this cap on you, and it has these little electrode sensors in it. And we're measuring the activity, electricity from your brain. This is just what EEG data look like. It's pretty much meaningless like that right now. But I want to show you what we did with it. So what we can do is look at when this activity occurs and line it up exactly to when people see different kinds of stimuli, such as these M's or W's. All right? So what we can do is take little, we call them epochs, little chunks of data that line up with every time they see the W, the no-go type of stimulus. And this is just how, this is maybe a little more info than you need, but you can average these little bits of data all together, and after you do all this averaging, this signal emerges that is meaningful. And so here's just a little diagram. Here's a signal that would emerge. You could ignore these labels. When somebody sees the no-go stimulus versus the go stimulus. And I chose all of this task, again, won't get into the details, because I know that the waves, the brain waves we pull out of this, we can actually localize pretty well to a particular region of the brain. And that region is the anterior cingulate cortex, that part of the brain that I told you was important for detecting when you need to do something different. All right, so we measured how strong this signal was in all our subjects to see if maybe more liberal subjects actually have stronger brain activity in this region, which is important for detecting when you need to change. And here are the results of our paper. And again, I wouldn't be showing it to you if we didn't find something. Again, look at this graph, the one on the left. This is, again, a scatter plot. Along this left y-axis here, as you go up the scale, the way we score these is a little wacky, but as we go up the scale, that means stronger brain activity in that region. It gets more negative, but and what we find is as people are more liberal on the left side of the scale, you can see that brain activity gets much stronger. And this is actually a really big effect. So as far as neuroimaging studies go, this is a pretty big sample and a pretty strong effect for ERPs, for this EEG type of brain activity. And we localized it and showed that indeed it was coming from that region of the brain, the anterior cingulate. Okay, any questions? I'll just have one more little conclusion.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I'm taking way longer than he wanted me to.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. So, a couple things. Yeah, ideology relates to the brain. I just put that obviously. I mean, can you think of something that doesn't relate to the brain? It's so funny when reporters get all excited. They say, what's something the brain was working when somebody thought about a political thing? Yeah.
Principle one.
But I think what this study really got at was that ideology is something extremely broad and seems really ephemeral, abstract, hard to pin down. But nevertheless, it seems like it is related to very fundamental neurocognitive processes, very basic ways in which we perceive and respond to information, and not political information, just every little, very basic types of information. And it extends these previous views on ideology, that ideology is purely related to environmental influences. So that's another reason why, for some people, it might seem surprising. You might think your political beliefs, well, that has nothing to do with your personality or the way your brain works. It must just have to do with how you're raised or something. This is starting to say that, no, it's more complex than that. It actually does get down to how you process information. And then the last thing I just wanted to add was, what this study did was link, again, really broad thing, ideology, down to a really basic aspect of brain processing. Other folks are even relating genes, specific genes, to ideology. And you might say, well, that's kind of cool because maybe there's a link. But what it doesn't emphasize is that there are so many different steps in the process between how do you go from this little brain process to actually going and voting for a candidate. So there's a lot of psychology that intervenes. So this kind of sets up the bookends, and so now a lot of the work is to try to fill in that gap. Yeah.
Makes sense. David, thank you very much.
Sure.
In a moment, I want to ask members of the audience here in the room if they have any questions that they would like to ask. So if you've had something on your mind, begin thinking about how you might formulate that. But let me just talk for a minute about what we've gotten, having heard these introductory remarks from all the panelists, both laid out here very explicitly and illustrated along the way, and probably everybody who walked in here was thinking this already. It's pretty clear, right, that the decisions, the political decisions that we're making as voters, right, there are some more complicated decisions that we're making about particular policies perhaps, but specifically as voters, both those who are identifying themselves specifically as conservative or as liberal, and maybe folks who aren't as committed to voting whatever ticket, but are picking up their cues just from the actual visual that they see when they see the two particular candidates who are running for in a particular election, that a lot of this is not what the founding fathers had imagined, right? This is not this is neither the short-term self-interest nor the enlightened self-interest nor none of that. That it's not rationality, and there is a rational piece to this. And I'd be interested to talk a little bit about the counterpoint to some of the ways in which thinking with the sort of the less adaptive part of the brain, conservatives actually make a case that there are situations in which being very straight down the line is actually more adaptive rather than less. And so we could talk about that a little bit if I want to play devil's advocate here, just in terms of us walking out all smug about how much smarter we are than the other guys. But I hope nobody has any questions about that. That at the very least, we've been able to establish that what's going on in voters' heads, whether you're ideologically committed to it or not, is not rational. The question then is how much of this that we can discover, that we can explore, that we can figure out what is going on, right? If not rational, then what in voters' heads is useful to candidates, political hacks like myself, etc., right? Who are actually doing the work of getting one candidate or the other elected. I can point, yeah, Joy.
Well, actually, I'd like to just add just a very brief comment to your study, and it's just absolutely just a beautiful study.
Thanks.
But going back to the early work that you cited, the Botvinnik work, that's showing that the cingulate gyrus actually has something to do with cognitive control. The way Botvinnik showed that is that the previous trial actually influenced one's ability to respond to a conflicting situation on the current trial. And that's a really, really important piece of information, because if one takes that factoid and relates it to your conclusion, one would say that the liberals perhaps were more able to respond to the previous trial or previous events. So it suggests a kind of sensitivity to reacting to the environment. It's just an idea. You know, most ideas are sort of wrong, but I made that association with what you were saying, and I think that it might help us to sort of extend our thinking a little bit.
I think it's totally consistent. Yeah.
It's a highly educated guess in this case. That particular.
Well, it is a guess, and I think it's important that we sort of we distinguish guess from data. And David has presented some really beautiful data here, but this
Absolutely.
I was just suggesting that there is a backdrop to your study. and to your paradigm that adds some additional insight to it.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. So the question before us now is what are the limits and what is the potential of this kind of research, sort of writ large, broadly speaking, to influence political thinking practice? How about, though, do we have any questions from the audience? We've had a lot of things thrown at us. If you can just find your way to a microphone.
A couple behind you.
Is this the only mic? We're going this way? Okay. Just stand up and tell us a little bit about who you are, or just briefly, and then what's on your mind.
So I have lots of questions, but
Pick one.
Start with one for Alex, and I'm wondering.
Say who you are.
I'm Barbara Tversky. I'm actually a psychologist.
Oh, yeah.
So I'd like to ask Alex how robust his task is to different kinds of judgment. You talked about competence,
Right.
but I'm sure you tried other kinds of judgments, and I'm wondering, in particular, did you ask who's more electable, and would that have predicted better than? A related question is, I assume that you're predicting better where you're getting a lot of consensus on the judgments, and less well when you're not getting consensus on the judgments.
So that's a very good question. First of all, yeah, that's really, I mean, what we measure as a correctly predicted race is if the majority of the participants say, yes, person A looks more competent. And to get a robust prediction, you need about 40 participants. You can have about 100, but it doesn't get much better than that. That's what you need to get the consensus. In terms of looking at other judgment, yes, and I had a couple of slides, but we looked at more than a dozen of judgments, and talking about rationality and irrationality, there was something very interesting because we looked at trustworthiness, likability, extroversion, openness to experience, charisma, all kinds of things. And the one singular judgment that predicts best the election outcomes is statistically controlling for the others is competence. And if you ask people, what is the attribute that you care most in your representative, and you list them a dozen of attributes, this is the one that comes on the top. So it's not a purely irrational process. I mean, the voters know what they care in a candidate. They're just not looking in the right place for evidence for the competence. They're
looking at their faces.
The rationality.
Did you ask specifically, though, which candidate do you think is more likely to be elected?
We had studies where we have mock voting. So if you ask people
which they would
who would you vote for?
Right.
And that is perfectly predicted by competence judgment. So you have one group who decides who looks more competent, and another is voting in this mock voting situation, and the correlation is pretty big. It's about 0.80, which is 64% of the variance in this judgment. So that seems to drive the effect.
Yeah, because you may or may not know this, but in the similar study that I was talking about before, they didn't ask. Did they ask competence? But the most predictive question was the one that you had suggested, was which one of these people basically looks like they're going to win.
Yeah, this
so
study
that's
was
also
actually
up there correlated.
Was very gratifying because, I mean, unfortunately in economics takes forever until your work is published.
Yes, that's true. It's a
I mean, we were
paper,
working at the same time on similar problems, and it was really gratifying when you have the same. And there was also a group in UK which did my favorite study with faces, Anthony Little, and they have this morphing technique. And later, if we have time, I can show you some of these images. But let's say you take 30 male faces, and then you morph all of them, and you get the average male face. And then you can subtract this.
Hot, right? Isn't the average face?
Average face are always more beautiful.
Right. Okay, just checking.
Average is beautiful. Contrary to the late belief in faces, that's exactly true. And then you can subtract this face from the face of Bush. And then you get a new face, but this is what makes Bush distinctive, and people don't recognize these faces belonging to Bush. And you do the same for Kerry. And so they did, first of all, they showed that these face judgments, and again they ask who would you vote, predicts these elections at the level of the states. They look Australia and New Zealand. But my favorite study was this context manipulations, where they would ask who would you vote without context, and it was pretty much even split. But then you ask who would you vote in a time of war, 70% go Bush. Who would you vote in a time of peace? 70% go Kerry. And I replicate this in Princeton. It's really, really robust finding. And the thing is that what makes Bush face distinctive, the face looks much more masculine, more leader-like, less forgiving, less intelligent. And the argument, well, I mean, this is what the face is. These are the attributes that would matter more in one context or another. So,
well, many of you probably seen. Anybody else remember when Bush was first emerged, the picture collage that had pictures of him and then pictures of apes, right? Pointing out the similarities. I don't know. Maybe perhaps that's it.
We're all similar to apes.
Well, sure, but they're a little less intelligent than we are. But anyway, another question? Oh, very good.
Just for David, maybe I've been to too many seminars. I'm too used to critiquing, so please. But I was wondering whether... Larry Amsel, psychiatrist at Columbia. I wonder about whether or not, because it's just a fact that actually most university campuses in America are very strongly, both in terms of faculty and everything, on the liberal side of things. I wonder whether these students that you were selecting for may not really have been a conservative versus liberal, but conformist versus nonconformist. I mean, it takes a certain nonconformism, to say I'm conservative on an American campus these days. So I'm wondering whether or not you're picking out those students who are kind of stubbornly, I'm sticking with the politics that I had before I got here. Before I got to California.
Yeah. That's a good possibility, and it's a good question, actually, and we should think about that. When just all I have are the data to look at and think about. So I don't know. We see this pattern is replicated across different cultures with different age groups. Not this particular brain study, but the general pattern of findings with the psychological variables. So that would be one reason that it's not just conformity. Also, we see this strong linear relationship, and I don't know what the conformists, if they would look different than the real liberals. I don't know if conformists would say that they're extremely liberal. But we find that the people who say I'm extremely liberal show the most of this brain activity and the most sensitivity to these changes. So that might be one reason why it wouldn't just be this conformist. But that's a really good idea to think about. Yeah, I'll bring that back to school and tell them.
Can I ask?
Yep, one more real quick.
Great.
And who are you?
Yeah, my name is Jared Seeger. I work in new media, internet-ish pursuits. My question is also for David, which is it's just a fact that certain areas of the country are very heavily liberal and certain are very conservative. So certainly we're not to believe that in Alabama there's something in the water that makes people pop out with brains that do certain things. So how much of this is just how much of it is brain act? Possibly there's something in the water there, but how much of it is brain activity that and I don't say that, I can't say this in scientific terms, but that's conforming to people's political beliefs that actually guides the way their brain behaves, and if that makes sense, just that their brain is actually behaving differently because their political beliefs are one way, the correlation causation thing. Because to me the geographic disparities are kind of strange.
And this actually goes to a point that you had, a bullet point that you had at the end there under conclusions, which was that this looked less environmental because it was rooted in the brain, which raised the question for me, the brain probably responds a little bit differently based on your environment. So
there's a huge chicken and egg issue with this stuff. I mean, one could speculate that political attitudes form later than these brain structures, but I don't know if that's actually true. They might form in concert, actually, and it's also like the brain is very plastic. I mean, some aspects of it are more plastic than others, but you might find that cultural changes do affect how your brain is working. So, do you want to say something about that?
Well, yes, the kind of thing that Dave is studying is very, very fundamental. One of the most exciting areas, I think, in brain research right now is the area of individual differences. And these individual differences are thought to exist at very low levels. That is, that they're essentially, they come with the package. That your brain has predispositions. And those predispositions can be modified by any environment that you're in, but you come with predispositions. And so in that context, I think that it's very hard to imagine how an environmental norm would change the phenomena. It may shift it a bit, but...
Yeah. Well, and maybe there's a larger question here too, which is to what degree the studies that we're seeing brains, different regions of the brains light up differently, and that those patterns being correlated with different kinds of behavior, right, or expressions of different kinds of opinions, whether it's whichever measurement technique we're using. Am I right to say that we're not actually seeing physical differences in the brain when it's not lighting up? In other words, you cut it open. I mean, not that we're doing this kind of research right now, but the actual structures themselves, like this is really big and overdeveloped in this person, whereas have we seen any of that yet, or do we just see that there's this same piece of machinery at this real estate location in the brain, and it's lighting up for these guys, and it's just not lighting up as much for these guys over here?
You want to say?
Well, the answer to the question is both.
Okay.
And that in neuroscience,
the answer is both?
The answer is both.
Okay.
In neuroscience, in psychology, we look at the brain in two different ways. One, a normative way, where we're interested in what we can determine that is transferable to the group. What are the general principles that describe us all? But on the other side of things, we're interested in individuals and individual differences. And neuroimaging has worked in applications, for example, in the medical world. Single subjects, single patients. We look at the brains of individuals. And of course, we see the same things as we see in the normative studies, but they're individualized. And so we see the variations. So the answer is both. I mean, did you...
Yeah, I would say the same thing. If anything, though, in my study, it's probably that their brains are not really different in terms of the size of these regions. There is there is a variability, but right now I'm looking at college students, and I doubt that the effects I'm seeing has to do with, the density. We don't know. All of it's working together, as Joyce pointed out, but it could just be that this situation really gets some people more engaged than others. Something like that. Plus, we're talking about neurons firing that we're picking up. That reflects density of neurons, sure, but it has to do with lots of neurochemical processes that are interacting. People have somewhat different connections. That's possible too. I mean, broadly they're the same, but there's individual differences. All this stuff.
I mean, surely if you see a brain map that doesn't imply anything about stability of individual differences, I mean, a lot of these experiments are very subtle contextual manipulation that lead to differences in these brain maps that you observe in the neuroimaging studies. So it's a long jump. I mean, it's a leap to say, okay, well, if you see these differences in, I mean, it certainly under-constrains the conclusion that it's a stable personality difference.
Got it.
I mean, it's a little bit more constrained when you're talking about more basic cognitive process, but I mean, that's one of the problems with brain imaging studies, because you have colorful, nice pictures, and people like to verify those pictures. But I mean, as Joyce started in the very beginning, I mean, your brain data in most of the cases are as good as your behavioral data. I mean, that's essential, and so. And talking about Sam Gosling, there's a personality psychologist. He has some data that apparently the individual differences across different states, which again, the question is, well, where did they come from? And surely they come from some basic genetic components, but this is very basic in terms of temperament, and then the environment might play its very critical role in shaping content-specific attitudes. It's all debatable.
Well, my family's from Alabama, and I'm pinko. This goes, yes, there's hope. There you go. This actually leads quite directly to the next question, which is, we have a lot of these behavioral studies, right? And we're getting some very interesting, robust data from them, and yet there's so much excitement around actually putting up a picture, right? And actually seeing this light up and looking at this data. So my question is, when you lay what we found from the behavioral studies, right, next to the fMRI data and the other physical data that we've gotten, are there any, do they totally line up? Or have we learned some things from one area that have not been verified or have been undermined by some of the data from the other realm? To what degree are they telling us the same story thus far? Anyone? Don't be bashful.
Well,
Go for it.
I can
Please
start
do.
this because, okay, so the way I think most of us in the behavioral sciences and neuroscience think about this is that behavior comes first, function first, and then structure, essentially is the rule, and that's sort of the rule of biology. And so a good behavioral finding is almost essential to designing a good functional imaging experiment. The good behavioral finding provides you material for a model about how the behavior works.
So you're not going to ask the question unless you have...
Right. It's essential. So the kinds of studies that David and Alex have presented today are essential to start an imaging study. And the imaging study is a limited study in many ways because what we're looking for is the neurophysiological substrate. That is, what is the brain machinery that actually underlies this behavior? And when you get the answer to that, you know a little bit more, but you haven't really answered the question that you've asked. What we're really interested in is behavior. So once you know how the car works, you kind of want to know a little bit more about the car, but you don't know everything about the road that you're driving on.
Is this okay to say this in Freud's house, to talk about behavior this way? This is okay? This is
dear.
okay. Okay, good. No, please, continue.
You're in Freud's house.
You're in Freud's house. Yes, I forgot. Sorry. I'll let you take over after that.
Do you have some thoughts?
No, I think Joy said it just right.
Okay, good. Despite the use of the B word.
What
yes.
she's essentially saying is that what we can learn from neuroimaging is somewhat limited, and it's kind of hopefully helping to fine-tune our knowledge of what we learn from behavioral studies.
So no great discrepancies just yet.
Well,
some?
I mean, you need to. The point is the brain data always the interpretation is always under constraint by your brain data. I mean, if you whatever paradigm you're using and you put people in the scanner, you will see lots of brain areas lighting up.
It's constrained by the behavioral findings, right?
Right. And so, for example, you can see a key region, and there was a bad example that I didn't want to bring up, but there was an op-ed piece in the Times by a group of cognitive neuroscientists where they show pictures of candidates and then they essentially interpreted this. So, for example, voters look at Edwards and then the anterior insula, a very important emotional region in the brain, lights up while they're experiencing disgust. Well, anterior insula is involved in at least 24 of different functions. So you can have a laundry list and you can always pick up the function that fits your story. I mean, immediately on the next day there was a letter by 20 prominent cognitive neuroscientists arguing that this is not the way to present this data and that's not the way to do science. So this is just a warning, and in that sense the data under constraint. I mean, if you don't have additional behavioral data, whatever, I mean, you need to have additional data that constrain your interpretation. I mean, the fact is the brain is super complex, and each one of these regions you can pick up, I mean, they are seen in dozens of different studies that don't have anything in common on the surface.
Yeah.
So we still don't know quite a bit.
This is
please,
Joy.
Just add just one small comment to what Alex is saying is that the neuroscience or the basic neuroimaging studies that are perhaps the most yielding in terms of information about the brain are not those that look for simple areas, but those that try to look for mechanism. Like, for example, in the cognitive control experiments, when you ask, how does one area of the brain actually influence another? When does cognitive control result in one area actually suppressing the activity of another? And how does that affect your experience of your emotion or the decision that you make? And so those types of studies go far beyond the old sort of study of looking for simple areas, and that's partly the answer to this.
Oh,
here's a question.
Great.
Because I imagine a lot of people... I'm sorry. I'm Sue Shapiro. I'm a psychologist, a clinician. I'm sure a lot of people in this room are feeling as anxious and agitated about this election as I am. And listening to you makes me even more pessimistic. And so what I'm wondering about is one specific thing is it makes me think of negative ads, and that might be something that you have some thoughts about. But also if you could say something about what can we do, given this, to make, do we know the results of the election already, or does it make sense? Is there something we can do?
That's really good. I think it's good to reorient this discussion to political issues too. So we're basically saying, no, the brain doesn't hold all the answers, but at least we can help interpret some of the stuff about psychology and the brain for the questions like this. So one thing you mentioned before, do you mind if I?
Please.
Was how you might coach Democratic candidates to say, hey guys, don't be so complex in your answers. You need to give quick, stupid answers, and that's what people are going to like. But I think what my data suggests is that Democrats don't like stupid answers.
That's right.
They like smart answers. So you're going to get the Democrats with the smart answers. You're not going to get them with the stupid attack ad because they're not going to buy it. Maybe Republicans, again, I don't want to, reporters will accuse me of being biased all the time. That's why I'm sensitive to sounding biased. But yet Republicans tend to like the stupider attack ads. That's how you get them. So that's exactly the next question. You got to ask yourself, why is somebody undecided at this point? I was thinking about this and preparing for this stuff too. Most people have made up their decision. There's a small fraction of undecideds. Why the heck are they still undecided? There's a heck of a lot of, I'm not swearing too, a hell of a lot of information out there right now. Are these people undecided because maybe they're the ones though who are most receptive to the not so complex ads themselves. So Democrats, you could say Democrats might lose those folks because those undecideds aren't into the complex message. You need to phrase something that they can get to, and if you don't, Republicans will definitely pick them up. So that's the concern.
From just a little bit of the strategic conversations that I've had around this very question, just to speak to that, folks who are undecided at this point are the ones who are not, by definition, ideologically committed to a conservative point of view or a more progressive liberal point of view, right? So you have these folks in the middle who are kind of just tuning in. And so it is true that if you give them a lot of information to process, they're not as likely to get to the end. And yet, especially, if this is to be very topical, especially in this year, they're not necessarily liking the very simple answers that they're getting from the conservative side. So that's kind of how we see that playing out.
That's good.
So, I've been thinking about Norman Potteritz, and
tell us who you are.
Bill Hurst, I'm a psychologist. He went from basically he was a leading neoconservative, and he went from a very liberal viewpoint to a very conservative viewpoint. And he would say he really made a major shift in thinking. So the general gist of both Alex's argument and your argument has been that to some extent our eventual decision-making is controlled by either unconscious material or some sort of inclination to process material in certain ways, things which don't admit to sort of intentional interference. So I wonder how much of this, of these eventual decisions that you make are driven, how much of the variance is driven by these unconscious or basic ways of processing things, and how much of them can be countered by intentional lines of thinking. If you had to do percentage of the variance in terms of your actual decision, where would you put that percentage of the variance?
So that's a very good point. In terms of predicting the actual elections with our data, what we have shown is that...
No, I'm not asking whether you can predict it. That's exactly what I didn't ask.
That's where I'm getting. He was my first advisor. I can get back. In fact, what we are describing most likely doesn't describe the average voter, certainly not, or the typical voter for that matter. The only thing we have shown is that we can predict the final outcome. We can do a pretty good forecast. But the real work is, well, how does it work out? And there have been several groups of political scientists trying to connect the dots. Chapel Lawson and Gabriel Lenz in MIT, group in UCLA. And what they seem to find, which is not surprising in a sense, is that that seems to work particularly to uninformed voters and undecided voters.
Low information voters.
Exactly.
The poli-sci people.
One problem, of course, is there were these estimates from political science maybe 20, 40 years ago that the really informed voter is about 10% of the population of voters. But the undecided voters are a very small proportion, and what I'm describing as probably this rapid snap judgments swaying their decision describes a very small percentage of the voters. If you're a strong partisan or you subscribe to a particular ideology, most likely you wouldn't care one way or another. So absolutely, I mean, so the real picture, and getting back to David's point, you might have different audiences receptive to different issues. Similarly, you can't talk about a typical voter. I mean, there would be many different voters, and there would be many different processes describing voting. And the direct answer to your question, we don't really know. I mean, if you start partialing out the variance and how much is intentional and how much is this shallow, implicit decision making.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I mean, that was clearly, and I don't know if that was made explicit, I guess, when you were describing your study, but the way that those reactions, those thin slice reactions, right, to that very minimal visual stimulus, the way that that could predict an election outcome is because it's swaying the voters who are breaking one way or the other way at the last moment in the middle. We know how most people are going to vote based on their, registration history and how often they show up to vote. It's the ones in the middle who are deciding at the end, okay, who do I like? Now, that's not to say that they don't hear some simple answers from one side and some complicated answers from the other side, and that's not part of what's going on in making their decision. But certainly these perceptions of competence or whatnot that are much more very clearly irrational or not rational are at play. Is there someone? Oh, no, someone just left.
I was thinking something.
You were thinking something. Do you want to telepathically ask that one?
Because I'm thinking about Obama and Hillary.
Sure.
And how I was a Hillary supporter, but I switched. But the thing was that Obama had this kind of passionate message, and people then criticized him for not having enough substance. Right? But he carried people by the simplicity, really, and power of that. And now it seems like he's responding to people saying, I want more specifics. But then specifics both reduce the energy that got him there in the first place, and then it's not going to get, from what you're saying, the swing voter.
Yep. Now, I think this is why he wrote that whole book before the campaign started, saying, here are all my policies, but that didn't seem to carry him through or guard him against that critique. I'm sure any one of us can yak about that topic for a long time. Are there particular pieces of either of psychology, the research that you've either done or know about, that would speak to some of what's going on more topically right now? In other words, when you're reading the paper, right, and you're reading all of these debates, whether it be that or Sarah Palin or whatnot, what is it that you three are thinking that some of the rest of us are not?
I want to move to Canada.
Yeah, we're all thinking that. Yeah, that does not make you unique.
Right.
Maybe you're thinking it more intensely than some of the rest of us are.
Closer to Alaska.
So true. Try New Zealand. She'll see your house from her. Yeah.
Alex, I had just a comment about some of the work that you're doing, and it also relates to the last question, and that is, we all know that faces have very privileged access in the brain, and that faces actually activate not only the visual system, but the face area, the famous face area, but also the amygdala. And it's been kind of a long-standing finding in the last few years that faces presented ever so briefly in fast format, like what you have done, actually activate a very particular part of the amygdala, basolateral amygdala, associated with very early emotional responses. Again, connecting the face stimulus with presumably an emotional response. And so the fact that this format that you're using and the stimulus that you're using actually drives a bottom-up emotional system may be suggestive an impact at an emotional level that relates to the question that the gentleman just asked.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we've done a lot of work actually in my lab that I didn't talk about using functional neuroimaging data, and in fact we do find that the amygdala plays a key role when you judge the basic valence. And the studies that you mentioned was really about briefly presented faces that express fear. It's one of the basic emotions that we care, but we do get similar effects, not with rapid presentations, but with faces that are emotionally neutral, yet faces that are perceived as more negative than other faces, also emotionally neutral, they evoke this stronger response in the amygdala. And yes, I think that it's one of the key regions in the brain that in part of this evaluative brain system that evaluates incoming stimuli and then it modulates, including the neural response in the visual cortex. It's almost like this bottom-up control of attention, like pay attention to this particular face. And that happens even when the subjects in the scanner, they have no idea what the study is about. So we tell them it's about memory. Now you're going to see a series of faces, and after each 10 faces you see a test face and you have to say, did you see it among these 10 faces? We don't really care about this. Is just a bogus task. So as far as they're concerned, it's about memory, yet the amygdala is tracking down these social perceptions of the faces. So absolutely, I mean, I think that, and the fact that you see it so rapidly, it's really more of an emotional process.
So we still don't have an answer to the last question, but there's a lot of suggestion
I don't think there will be
very
ever
emotional.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's a lot of interesting data on how emotion affects your ideological identification and also the way that you perceive data. So you can think of emotions as tuning the way you perceive things in your environment, because once you have an emotion such as threat or fear or anxiety, your adaptive response is to seek safety and to get away from that threat. And so that tunes your perception to be vigilant for more threats, look out for maybe safety, and mobilize toward that. Getting back to political psychology, there's interesting data suggesting, well, looking at how anxiety and fear affects your political decision making. So you know how we have the threat levels? We have the so Bush is really, well, not Bush, but let's say folks working for him, they must be reading some of these books and using it against us psychologists or something, because as that level goes up, people shift conservative. It's natural. As that level goes up, it doesn't matter whether it's going up for any reason. Who the heck knows who's making it go up and down? I sure don't. But as it goes up, people shift toward being more conservative. And what they want is somebody who's going to be more like stereotypical masculine and fight for them and also be more authoritarian. So they've got a sweet racket. If they can keep wars going on, they're going to win every election. And that's how it is, and that was already mentioned, and that's what's really scary about that. And what's cool about the brain research is if you can identify certain regions of the brain, you can trace through interconnections within the brain to get a sense of how these emotional areas do tune other parts of the brain that are involved in decision making and perceptions. As psychologists and neuroscientists, we can explain it, we can map it out. I guess the big challenge now is how do you implement this in society to try to block it and help people think with a straight head when they're being faced with all this imagery about war and threat levels.
Hi, my name is Joe Plotkin. I'm also in the internet business and a political junkie. First, to your point that you just made, I mean, that's the basis of most demagoguery, fascism, Nazism, and all that have used fear for years and years. But I was just sitting here thinking in terms of this political campaign that maybe one of the walls that Obama has run into with his message of change relative to the research you presented is that change is scary because it's unknown. And so he has to somehow make doing the same thing we've been doing scarier than this sort of tough to define change going forward. And that's his trick over the next 2.
Well, Bush has started with that. Bush has started making what was going on now scarier than potential change.
Actually,
but you're very right. Yeah.
I have a friend of mine who's now a business school professor at Harvard. He was at NYU, Jason Reese. I don't know if you know Jason. And he was at Princeton. Okay. And we all know our
Very small.
He has a cool study where he's looking, and this is relevant, looking at drugs that people will take. And will you take a lot of people will take a drug to cure your cold. Will you take a drug that changes something about your psychology? So will you take a drug if it will maybe make you, I don't know, more loving or something like that? And people don't like it if it starts changing something that's a core trait. What he found was that if he shifts the advertisement to be like, you know, you used to be somebody who was really loving and who really was like in this psychological profile, but what you are now is not you. Right. Will you take the drug now? Then they love it. Then they really want the drug. So what Obama's got to do is say, remember a time when there was peace and how good things were, maybe the Clinton
So it's
years?
a restoration rather than a moving forward to the great unknown. That's
and
right.
so then what that does is make the change actually back to certainty. And at least the marketing studies I know of suggest that could work.
So let America be America again.
Well,
yeah, I know. Got his address?
But it's interesting how directly that speaks to these kinds of themes. I know in 1996, which we all remember suffering through the bridge to the 21st century, hearing that repeated ad nauseum, that was in direct response to then candidate Dole's reference to 50s small town America, and he wanted to do that restoration theme, and the decision was made after some polling on the Democratic side that it had to be about the future, it had to be about marching forward without that piece. Now, I don't know if that translates directly given how personal that is in terms of who you are as opposed to the environment that you live in. But it's certainly true. I mean, anybody in this room knows that self-reported preferences, the kinds that most political professionals are going on, right? Most political professionals are going on polling, which is, you know, you ask them this and they say, well, what should I say here? And you get that answer as opposed to taking a look under the hood, as you were saying before. So that's the kind of insight that very well may come from this area of research and speak to what we should and shouldn't be doing as operatives. Yeah.
Well, another sort of additional factoid here is that a lot of the behavioral work recently has shown how decisions actually change under conditions of risk and fear. Mm-hmm. And one of the studies that particularly comes to mind are the studies of temporal discounting that show that under conditions where people are frightened or they're under fearful environments, they will shift their decision making to short-term decisions rather than to investment-type decisions. And so I think that well-known finding actually relates to sort of what we're talking about, that as fear goes up, people are going to shift their attitudes and decisions toward an immediate decision that rectifies it rather than thinking about the future.
Like
so I think
now.
Relating this to change, you know, we want change now, we don't want it later somehow.
Or we want oil now and not solar later.
Yes, exactly. That's a better example.
Yeah. That actually brings up a point that's been kind of kicking around with a couple of the questions here, which is, what, in terms of what's being found here, have you noticed any, to what degree have you guys who actually know the real deal, because you're doing the research and going to the conferences, to what degree have you seen any of this percolating out into the broader political discussion, and how much of it has been even vaguely accurate? Like, I got my lobes mixed up earlier, right? And I will tell you, as a professional at least on the Democratic side, that I pay a lot more attention to these issues in general, even if my parables are a little bit fuzzy when I retell them for hopefully good effect. But what do you see out there? Are you seeing the kinds of, you mentioned this was a well-known effect, right? That
Well,
fear
the
creates
effect,
different temporal decision-making.
Yeah.
Are you seeing any of this out there in where you would like to be seeing it? And
well, I think you raised a really important point about how scientists, psychologists, and neuroscientists are able or not able to translate what they know into the real world of applications. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot more we can do. Maybe you guys have some other opinions about this, but that this schism between what goes on in our laboratories and what you all out there really want to know is very great. and we could probably do better. Perhaps you could tell us more what you want to know. I mean, more dialogues like this might help. But I think this is a really important problem. So much of what we see about the science on the front page of the New York Times or even in the Science Times is so wrong. It's just like it's hard to even read it. I don't know. What do you think? And so we need to pay a lot more attention.
Yes. I see some heads nodding. Around the room as well.
There are some folks I know who are advising. So one of my colleagues I know was working with Hillary in her group for quite a while, maybe still. So I know she's trying to help apply social psychology science to real campaigns. Drew Weston, he wrote an influential book.
How many in the room are familiar with the book, The Political Brain? Not to be confused with George Lakoff's The Political Mind, but The Political Brain by Drew Weston?
Weston's thesis has mostly to do with how understanding emotion and how emotion works in the brain is going to help us understand political decision making. But he's really reaching out well. I don't know if any of you watched Now with David Brancaccio on PBS, really good political show. Drew Weston was on it, and he was just like giving all these great gems of advice to the Obama campaign. I almost said Obama McCain. Obama campaign on how to take one of their core messages and phrase it in a way that will just go right to everybody's gut. So that was really heartening to me to see science getting out in the public, and also to see it going out to Obama. But you got to take that off the tape.
Well, you know what?
But so it's happening anyway.
Right.
And so we're in these public discussions also, it's happening.
Yeah, as far as I know, that's about as far as it's gotten. There have been Drew has gotten through to some professional pollsters, and I do think, since we're being a little bit partisan or commenting on the political operations, I do think the Republicans get this stuff more. I think they listen to, actually probably not necessarily to academia, but they listen to Madison Avenue a lot more than Democrats have been listening to academia. Alex.
I want to make one insertion that, psychology is still invisible in policy, and you can even forget about political lines and getting into the politics, but even building policies. Like every president has a advisor panel of economists, but there's no advisor panel of psychologists. And
that's right.
I'm lucky to have a joint position with the Woodrow Wilson School for Public Policy, and there are only 3 policy schools which teach psychology as part of their core curriculum. And because a lot of this message is not rational, but the science of policy economics is based on the rational actor model. And a lot of the psychology is how this model is not the right descriptive model of human behavior, not necessarily prescriptive, but certainly doesn't describe human behavior. So it's absolutely true that psychology is really absent. People have made headways. There are a lot of now people who are trying to do that, including Danny Kahneman, who was, you all know, collaborator with Amos Tversky, and he had the Nobel Prize for Economics Psychologist in 2002. And many people have been trying to get involved, but it's not an easy process, and absolutely psychology needs to be part of policy building. Simply you need to get right the assumptions.
So there's some progress, but a lot more to be done. We have a question here, and I bet we have a lot more questions around the room, but what I want to do at this point is just to say, well, first of all, I hope that this discussion goes a couple more steps in the direction of what we want to do in terms of getting the real science more broadly disseminated out there to the public and doing our political thinking. But also to thank all the panelists and to thank you all again for coming. We will hang around a little bit afterwards if you have some extra questions and take them then. But otherwise, thanks very much, and thank you for hosting this, and good night.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philoctetes events is available at philoctetes.org.